Welcome to today's webinar, How to Troubleshoot Group Policy in Windows 10. Today we have John Panagakis. So John is a Microsoft certified trainer with more than 20 years of experience in the IT industry. John is currently an instructor at Global Knowledge in Canada who specializes in Microsoft network and server maintenance and troubleshooting.
This is an excerpt of a module from a course known as, or the name of the course is Supporting and Troubleshooting Windows 10. It's a 5-day course on supporting and troubleshooting Windows 10, and this is one module out of that. It's intended for people that support Windows 10 to give them a good background knowledge on how GPOs work and what they can do to try to figure out when something's going wrong, if it's a GPO problem, where that's coming from. But it does start by giving us a little bit of a foundation about how GPOs work, and that's where we're going to start here. Now, overview, group policy application. So first thing they're saying is options for deploying configuration settings with group policies, and there's two different ways to do that. We're going to focus here on deploying group policies, or passing on the settings via Active Directory, ADDS, but you can do that manually as well via local GPOs. How do you do it local GPOs? There's a command known as gpedit.msc. I say a command, it's an MMC snap-in is what it is. So gpedit.msc, MSC, it's an MMC snap-in and known as local group policy editor. And when you do this, you don't have all the settings. You don't have all the bells and whistles that you would have from a domain-based GPO, but you do have a lot of the settings and most of the operating system settings as well. We're not going to focus on that just because there's not tons of this kind of thing that happens out there. Generally speaking, if you have a computer that's domain joined, well, you want to be doing this via ADDS. But just putting it out there, if you do have computers that are not domain joined, or for some other obscure reason that you might have as well, you can do this at the local level. But if you're doing it locally, just remember, local computer account, local user accounts. Well, there's no such thing really as a local computer account. It's just a computer account. So that's always going to apply. But then the user settings would only apply to a user logging on with a local user account. So if it's a domain joined computer and you apply local GPO, it'll still apply the computer settings if they're appropriate, but it'll only do the user settings if it's a local user account. So let's just get that straight, keep it straight, and remember that going forward. Okay, now the next part here says group policy settings consist of computer configuration, user configuration, policy settings, and preferences. Let's talk about this. And for that, I'm actually going to go over to my virtual machine. And so I have a VM here running, and it's a domain controller. This machine here, London DC1 or Lund DC1, is a domain controller. And we're going to open up our group policy management console that I hope most of you are familiar with. If not, just quick little background. This has been available since the Windows Server 2003 days, and that was an option back then, but it's been the default and really pretty much only way of doing these things starting with 2008. So I'm going to edit a GPO, and I'm going to edit the default domain policy. In the default domain policy, what I just want to point out is what we've got here is computer configuration and user configuration. Okay, so let's just talk about how these GPOs apply, because a lot of the confusion about GPOs and helping troubleshoot is understanding what actually happens, how these things happen. And again, I'm going to start off pretty basic, and we're going to work our way up here. But think of this, right? You have a computer and it's powered off. Let's say you power this thing on. First time it ever, it comes back online and it's a domain joined computer, the computer has to authenticate with Active Directory. I'm assuming everybody knows this, but computer accounts have passwords just like user accounts do, and the computer has to authenticate just like a user account does. Once the computer account is authenticated, then we know that really is, London CL1 or whatever the name of the computer is. But it can identify which Active Directory site that computer belongs to. It can identify, obviously, based on that, which domain it belongs to and which OU structure that belongs to. All right, site domain OU. And it could be sub-OUs as well. That's why I said OU structure. Once we know the site domain and OU structure that the computer account belongs to, then it pulls a list of all the GPOs linked to that site, to that domain, and to that OU structure. All right? Once it's got that, then it only applies the computer configuration part of the GPO. This doesn't bother applying the user configuration because we don't know who's logged on. This is strictly for computer login, therefore computer configuration. So a common problem people have is they put all the settings they want, user and computer style settings, and one GPO, then they wonder why one or the other don't apply. Right? That's a problem that people come across a lot when they're relatively new to this, so it's something we need to understand. Now, once the computer configuration has been applied, then the user logs in. So once the user logs in, we know that we know the site domain and OU that the user belongs to, and they could be different, right? This is not an AD course, so I'm not going to get into all of that, but they can be different. But once we know the site domain and OU structure that the user account belongs to, what does it do next? Kind of the same thing. It pulls a list of the GPOs that link to that site, that domain, those OUs, but then only applies the user configuration part of that. So again, same problem, but from a different angle. If you put all these settings, in one GPO, and wherever it is that you link them, if the users in the computer account don't share some of the, like I said, site domains and OUs, you might not be getting all the settings that you think you would be getting. And it looks like it's a problem. It looks like something hasn't gone wrong, but it's not really, nothing's gone wrong. It's working the way it's supposed to. But if you don't know about it, then it looks like a problem. It looks like you need to troubleshoot it. It's more about applying the settings properly. All right. So that's the first part here. They're talking about user configuration and computer configuration. The next thing they're talking about is what they call policies and preferences. So let's talk about that by looking at them in the GPO. So if we come back to our GPO, and I'll zoom in so it could be clear. Whoops, let me do that again. We got policies and we got preferences. Now, when Active Directory was introduced all the way back with Windows 2000 Server and back in those days, we didn't have policies and preferences. All we had is what is listed there in the policies container. All right. Preferences were introduced back in Windows Server 2008, and we've had them ever since then. What's the difference between the two? So what I'm going to say now, guys, there is exceptions to what I'm going to say. There's so many GPO settings. There's thousands and thousands of GPO settings. So when you got that much of anything, there's going to be exceptions. But by and large, so everything I'm saying here is kind of by and large. But by and large, when policies apply to the control panel type of settings, let's say like network settings or file explorer settings or things like that, it does what it does what they term, it writes those registry settings to a special part of the registry that you can't change. Right? There's a special part of the registry, and when they say special secure part of the registry, all they really mean is that you just can't get to the reg edit. It's there obviously, but it's secure. You're not supposed to mess around with it. All right. So it writes those settings, if it's a policy, to this part of the registry that the user doesn't, or the computer actually doesn't have access to it. So when a GPO applies a policy, again, there's exceptions, but when a computer applies a policy, the user cannot change it regardless of what permissions they have, right? Regardless of what rights they have. You could be the domain admin, you could be the enterprise admin, you could be whatever, it doesn't matter. It's written to the part of the registry that cannot change. And the way you're going to see that is, well, it depends on the setting. Certain settings, once you go into them, you'll be able to see how it's configured, but you're going to see that everything's grayed out. So even though you can see the settings, you can't change them. You can't interact with them. Other settings, you just get an access denied off the top. So let's say the GPO setting, the policy is blocking the control panel. You double click on it, you'll get an error message that your control panel is blocked, and it ends there. So it depends on the kind of setting. Policies work differently. Policies write to the regular, I'm making air quotes here, it writes to the regular part of the registry. So what that means is that once the GPO has applied the preference, because it's writing it to where these settings usually get written to, whoever is logged on to that machine for that session, if they would normally be able to change it, they still would. Let's say, assume you do a language preference or something like that, right? And you are the local administrator or someone that has a local admin rights, you'd be able to change a preference, but you wouldn't be able to change a policy. That's the big difference between policies and preferences. There's functional differences as well, but conceptually, that's the difference between a policy or a preference. So again, if you're not, people that are not very familiar with it, have not worked with it a lot, they see it as a troubleshooting thing like, hey, I applied this via GPO. Why is it that my user can change it? Well, most likely because it's been applied as a preference as opposed to a policy. All right, so again, it's about knowing how these things work, and obviously, ultimately, it's testing them to make sure you're getting the results you want. But that's the key difference between policies and preferences. Now, what I'm going to start doing is at the end of each one of these slides, I'm going to ask if anybody's got any questions. If you do, feed them to Sarah. She'll pick one or two. Obviously, we do have time constraints, but if you have those questions, feed them to Sarah. She'll pass them to me, and we'll address them before we move on. So, is there any questions?
So just one question to define what OU stands for.
Okay, an OU is an organizational unit. So if you look at Active Directory, we got forests. Forests make up domains. Domains are broken down into different components, and one of those are, well, it's organizational units and containers. An organizational unit is a management unit of Active Directory. So think of it as, think of it this way, right? You have one domain and you have all your user accounts, all your group accounts, you have everything under one umbrella, which is the domain. And that's okay if you're working for a small organization with like, 20, 30, 40, 50 people, maybe you can get away with it. But imagine you work in a really large organization with thousands of users. Imagine one container with all your user accounts, one container with all your computer accounts, one container with all your group accounts. It becomes really hard to manage. So the point of OUs is you create, they're like partitions, but for Active Directory as opposed to hard drives. You create OUs, organizational units, and then you start placing your objects, your user accounts, group accounts, computer accounts, you start placing them in OUs, and then you delegate somebody to manage those OUs. So imagine a scenario where you have an office in New York, another one in Ottawa, another one in Chicago, okay? And you got several hundred users in each. Instead of all of them being just under the domain and one person has the rights to manage it all, which is maybe what you'd want, but maybe another way to go is create an OU for each one of those locations. One New York, one Ottawa, one, what did I say, Chicago, I think, or whatever I said. You create those OUs, you put the appropriate user accounts, group accounts, computer accounts within the OUs, then you delegate the local IT staff to manage the OU, therefore all the objects within it. That's what an OU is. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any other questions?
So I think that covered that one. I have one more here. So if I apply a preference and the user changes it, will it reapply on the next GP update?
By default, yes, but you can control that too, actually. So and I'm going to do this really quick here, guys, because we do have time constraints, but if I grab a preference like start menu settings, okay, and they all have this actually, but if there's a tab, they all have a general tab, they all have a common tab, and depending what the preference is, there's a whole bunch of things in between, depending on the preference. But under the common tab, there's an option that says apply once and do not reapply. And by default, it's not checked. So it does not apply once and then not reapply. In other words, it will come back. So when your GPOs refresh, which by default is every 90 to 120 minutes, or if you do a GP update or whatever, it will come back. Okay?
All right, thank you.
Let's move on. No problem. Okay, processing group policies. The next key thing we need to understand is, and what I'm going to say, guys, is more theoretical. Computers don't actually do what I'm going to describe. They don't do it in the way that I'm going to describe it. But the reason I describe it and the reason the slide has it the way they do is for us to understand what happens in case of a conflict. Now, what do I mean by conflict? There's absolutely nothing that stops you from creating 4 GPOs, one local, one linked at the site level, one linked at the domain level, one linked at the OU level, so 4 different GPOs, with a couple of dozen settings in each GPO, but you introduce one setting in each GPO that's conflicting. You understand? So let's say you set up, I'm going to go with an old school example. GPO 1 says Windows update at 1 a.m. or install the updates at 1 a.m. GPO says do it at 2 a.m. GPO 3 says do it at 3 a.m. GPO 4 says do it at 4 a.m. You get the idea. I've introduced a conflict. There's only one registry key for when Windows update is going to happen, so it can't happen at 1 and at 2 and at 3 and at 4. There's only going to be one. Well, so which GPO wins the conflict, or even better, which GPO setting wins this conflict? So this is why we're talking about this, and this is why the slide is showing us what it shows us. So again, computers don't actually do it this way, but what you need to do to figure this out is think of the GPOs as executing in order. Think of GPO 1 goes first. It applies its settings to the registry. Then GPO 2 goes first. So in this case, the site goes second, I should say. It puts its settings in the registry. Then GPO 3 executes. It writes its settings in the registry. GPO 4 then does its thing. It leaves its settings in the registry. So if you do it in that order, who wins the conflict? The rule is last applied wins. So 1 applies first, 2 applies second, 3 applies third, 4 applies fourth. Last applied wins, so the OU level GPO wins that conflict. And again, we're talking about conflicting settings. You still get all your non-conflicting settings, but as far as conflicting settings go, it's last applied wins. You following? So in this example, and another way to think of it is this way: site overrides local, domain overrides site, OU overrides domain, sub-OU overrides parent OU, and so on and so on. Last applied wins. Again, computer doesn't actually do it that way, but if you think about it that way, that's what helps you figure out your conflict resolution. And the other thing is, remember, computer account logged in first. In the previous slide, I talked about computer settings and user settings. Remember, computer logs in first, applies its settings first. Then the user logs in, the user applies their settings. So if there's any conflict between the user and the computer part of the GPO, and there can be, there's plenty of settings that appear both in computer configuration and user configuration. So who wins computer versus user settings? Well, again, last applied wins. User applies last, therefore user wins. We can change all of this, but this is the way it all works by default. Okay? Any questions?
Oh, okay. So one question here, if a policy setting exists under both the computer and user, does it matter where I make the change?
It does, because like we just said, last applied wins, right? So if it's just one GPO by itself and that's it, then it wouldn't matter. But if there's other GPOs you have to contend with and figure out, okay, well, if these all are happening at the same time, which settings is it going to apply, then it does matter. Does that answer the question?
I think so,
it does,
but if it doesn't,
okay.
please put in a follow-up question to that. So another one here is GPO configuration for Windows servers, client machines the same.
Can you repeat that, please?
Is GPO configuration for Windows servers and client machines the same?
Configuration. You have to expand on that question. So whoever put in that question to Sarah, can you just expand by what you mean exactly? If you're talking about the way they apply, they don't apply exactly the same way, but I'm going to cover that in a bit. If you're asking about settings, no, they're not the same, because like a Windows 10 box will have different kinds of settings than a Windows server would. So I'm not sure what the question is, but I need to move on for now, clarify it with Sarah, and I'll come back at the end and finish off those questions. Okay? But for now, I need to move on. But I think I answered your question. All right, modifying the group policy processing order. When you look at this, okay, there's something profoundly wrong with this. I know it's too difficult to do an interactive question and answer, always having to go through poor Sarah for this, so I'm not going to do that. But I'll tell you, when we discuss this in my classes, I ask people, well, there's something's absolutely wrong with this, isn't there? Strictly from a rights perspective, think about it. The domain GPO is overriding the site GPO. Again, I'm not asking the question, but ask yourself the question. Who's got the permissions to manage and create and play around with the sites? That's the enterprise admin. Who's got the permissions to create and manage and play around with domains? The domain admin. I'm being general here, of course, right? So by default, the domain admin's GPOs are overriding the enterprise admin's GPOs? Yeah, by default they are. And take it a step further. Who manages OUs? Somebody that the domain admin probably hired as a subordinate and has delegated them the rights to do it. But that person is overriding the domain admin, who's overriding the enterprise admin. It kind of doesn't make sense from a strict rights perspective. But the point is, people that work together tend to have common needs. And because of that, they tend to, and again, this is a general statement, they tend to belong to the same OUs. And because of that, we apply the GPOs at the OUs level. And because of that, we have less conflicts to deal with. That's why it works that way, and generally speaking, it works really well. But if that doesn't suit our needs, there's a couple of things we can do to change that. So these are the 4 things you can do to change the way the GPO is applied by default: link order, enforce, block, or link enabled. So let me show you all 4 of those. So if we come back to our group policy management console, so I'm going to take an OU here. Let's say this OU, manager's OU. There's 2 GPOs linked to it. GPO A and GPO B. The first thing the slide talks about is link order. So we've talked about what happens when there's a conflict between the user and the computer part of the GPO. We're good with that. We know what happens when there's a conflict between site, domain, OU, local, and the rest of it. But what if we have GPOs at the same level? And what if they're in conflict? Again, these things don't happen often, but what if they did? So in this case, we've got 2 GPOs, GPO A and GPO B. Zoom in really quick so you see what I'm talking about. 2 GPOs, A and B, and they're both linked to the manager's OU, right there. So what happens if A and B is in conflict with each other? Who wins that one? That's what this link order here is. And you see these little arrows on the side? right? These arrows here on the side, they help us change that order. So GPO A is currently at the top of the link order, therefore GPO A would win any conflicts. If I drop that down, now GPO B is at the top, GPO B would win the conflicts. And I can move it back and forth. Furthermore, to help you figure this stuff out, you see there's 3 tabs here: Objects, Inheritance, and Delegation. If I look at the Inheritance tab, it tells me which GPOs are being applied to this container, in this case the manager's OU, and the precedence, top to bottom, top, think of it as last applied. The guy at the top of this list, that's the one that wins all the conflicts. So GPO A would win all the conflicts. And marketing GPO would lose all the conflicts. But let's look at the effect of changing this link order, right? GPO is at the top. If I drop it by 1, I come back to inheritance. B was like, I left B at the top here, meaning it's going to win all the conflicts. So it reflects in the group policy inheritance tab. So this is a really good, useful tool to try to figure out what happens in case of. All right. What else can we do? We can block inheritance. If you go back to the slide, think of it this way. If we go back to this slide, think of it this way. When somebody, let's say our friend here in the orange unitard or whatever it is that person's wearing, that person there logs in. He doesn't only get the GPOs, and his computer, of course, as well, doesn't only get the GPOs linked to their OU, they also inherit the GPOs from the domain and from the site. Local GPOs don't get inherited. They apply directly to your registry. So let's take local GPOs out of the discussion. But there is an inheritance. Well, you can block that inheritance. So you come back here to the manager's OU, right click, block inheritance. Now, your visual cue is this little blue exclamation mark. If you see that there, that's your visual cue that it's been blocked. But look what happened over here. The domain level GPOs have gone away. Why? They've been blocked. If I remove the block, they come back. I put back the block, they go away. All right, so it's another thing you can do to manipulate or change the way these GPOs apply by default. Another thing you can do is you can force a GPO. Actually, the term is called enforce. And again, for enforce, I want you to think of it this way. Think of the GPOs executing in order, like we said, right? Site and domain, then OU, and then so on. Think of it this way. If you enforce a GPO and it manages to apply, nothing will ever be able to override its settings. It will win all conflicts. So to see that, back here again, marketing GPOs at the bottom of the list. Because it's a domain GPO, they get overridden by OUs, and at the domain level, we can move them up and down, right? Just like before. But if I enforce it, right click enforced, and I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little golden padlock that gets added to it right there. That's your visual cue. If we go back to the manager's OU and look at that inheritance tab, look what happened now. Marketing's at the top of that list, meaning it's going to win every conflict. Well, why? That's not natural. That shouldn't be happening. It's a domain GPO. It should be at the bottom. So it tells us it's because it's enforced. Okay? Now, the question most people have, and I'm assuming a lot of you, if not all of you have, is, well, what happens if you have an enforce and a block? So I'm enforcing at the domain level, but what happens if I block at the OU level? What happened there? With the domain GPO that was not enforced got blocked, but the domain GPO that was enforced did not get blocked. Remember what I said maybe a minute ago? If a GPO that's enforced manages to apply, meaning it hasn't been blocked, so it applies. I mean, always keeping in perspective that they're going in order. If it manages to apply and it's enforced, it'll always apply its settings. Nothing can block it. It's always going to win. That's why it's at the top now. And again, just to show, if I remove the block, the one that wasn't enforced comes back. And if I remove the enforce and refresh it, this guy drops back down to where it all started. The last thing you can do to change the order is grab a GPO like this, and if you right click it, you have this link enabled option. So if I remove it, I'm disabling the link. And if I come back to managers one more time, the GPO that I unlinked went away. It's not applying anymore. And if I relink it, as I'm sure you would have guessed, it comes back. All right, guys? Any questions there? I'll take one question. Because of the time, we'll take one question if there is any.
So one question on how to determine the policy order. So you presented
Mhm.
by default the order, but said the order can be changed. So how do you see what the order that will be used? Sorry.
It's not that the order changes. So I'm not sure. I don't know if I said order changes or not. If I said that the order changes, I was wrong. The order itself doesn't change, but you're manipulating the order by using the blocks, by using the enforces, by disabling the links, by changing the precedence. So if I didn't say it right, I apologize, but that's what I meant. You can never get every domain GPO to override every site GPO unless you use the tools which you said. So you're not changing the order, you're playing with the GPOs themselves and their order by either enforcing or blocking. Okay? All right, let's move on. Group policy filtering. Here's another key thing here. So GPOs, I know they're called group policies, but group policies don't apply to groups by default. And let me explain, right? We link GPOs at the site level, domain level, and OU level. We don't link GPOs to a group. And I'm sure there's a bunch of you out there right now saying, hold on, I'm sure there's something that we do at our office where, we add people to groups and that's how they get their GPOs or something along those lines. So how can those both be true? And again, from my end, I showed you the GPO configuration. There was user configuration, computer configuration. Nothing in there had anything to do with groups. As a matter of fact, if let's say you went to your domain, and please don't do this, but I'm just saying, if you went to your domain right now, open up Active Directory using computers, made an OU, brand new OU, moved every group in your domain to that OU, and linked a GPO that did everything and anything under the sun, nothing would happen. Because it doesn't care which group you're in. It does it based on, site domain OU and where the computer account and where the user account exist. But there is a way to work this so you can apply a GPO, well, not apply, but that only gets applied to members of groups. And you could either do this inclusion or exclusion list style. And that's what they call filtering. And this is what I want to show you next. So let's look at this, okay? So I'm at the domain level here. Our adatum.com is a generic name for all Microsoft labs. So adatum.com is our domain, and we have a GPO called marketing linked to it. To understand how this works, you have to understand how to read this interface here. So what this is telling us here, security filtering, authenticated user. So if you're an authenticated user, that's first condition, and your location is adatum.com. So if you're an authenticated user of this domain, you get the marketing GPO. I like to think of this as a very simple Venn diagram. Venn diagrams are those diagrams where you have multiple circles and they're all kind of touching, and the part that all circles have in common, that's your sample data. That's how I like to think of this. You got to be both part of authenticated users and adatum.com to get this GPO. So what if I only wanted members of the marketing group to get this GPO? I can't link it to the marketing group. Well, what I can do is link it to the domain as an example, remove authenticated users, and then add the marketing group. So how does this read now? If you're a member of marketing and you're part of adatum.com, then you get the marketing GPO. So even though we linked it at the domain level, we filtered it in a way or created a whitelist that ensures that only members of the marketing group would get these GPO settings applied. That's one way to do it. That's the whitelist or the inclusion list way of doing it. Another option you have, and this is kind of buried deep down in there, so bear with me here, right? So you see right now, I'm in the scope tab. There's a delegation tab here. So if I come over to the delegation tab, and at the bottom right, I got this advanced button, okay? If I click on advanced, I get a NTFS style property sheet. And there's a permission here called apply group policy. So what if I wanted to apply to everybody in marketing except for, or maybe even everybody in the domain, except for a very specific person? I can add that person to the list and deny them the right to apply the group policy. So even though it's linked and it's filtered for a group or members of anything that you want to define that this person belongs to, the particular person's been denied the right to apply the policy. Whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to click that. I'll do it the simpler way. Let's say Abby Parsons. So we take Abby Parsons and we say apply group policy, deny. So Abby Parsons does not have the right to apply this policy. So just we've excluded Abby as opposed to including the marketing group that we did, in the interface before. So that's the whitelist, blacklist, inclusion, exclusion list, whatever you want to call it. That's what they call GPO filtering. Okay. Any questions on that?
We have one person who's had numerous issues when trying to use security filtering. Are there exceptions to which GPO settings can use this?
Not that I know of. I've never come across any. Now, like I said, in Windows Server 2016, there's well over 4,000 different settings, and I can't claim to have checked every setting individually. But as far as I know, and any documentation I've read, there's no exclusion that I know of. Now, if you like, send your email address to Sarah. She'll pass it on to me, and we can go back and forth and see if there's anything I can, that can help you with. But off the top of my head, there's no exclusions that I know of. Okay, it's a great question actually. Nobody's ever asked me that in 20 years of talking about GPOs. All right, let's move on. Now, remember when we talked about the link order? And before that, we were saying last applied wins, and we said the computer goes first and the user goes second. So because of that, the user wins the conflicts, okay? But what if I don't want the user to win the conflicts? Why? That doesn't matter. Or think your typical Citrix terminal services remote desktop solution, right? Where your users are logging onto your server. It's remote, but they're logging onto your server. You don't have to answer the question, but if you ask any administrators of those servers, do you want user GPOs applying to your servers via these types of sessions? I'm pretty sure they would all say no. So this is what loopback processing is. Now there's two modes to loopback processing. I'll explain both, but I also want to say I've never seen this used in any way except for the replace mode. But I'm going to talk about both. So what loopback processing does is this, and again, it's there to help the computer win the conflicts when there's a user versus computer GPO conflict. The way loopback processing, or the way you want to think of it, is this. When loopback processing is enabled, when the computer logs in and it figures out which site, domain, and OU structure the computer belongs to, it doesn't just apply the computer settings, it also applies the user settings in those GPOs. So basically, it replaces, that's what it's called, replace. It replaces the user settings from the user session and replaces them with the user settings from the computer's session GPOs. It never bothers applying any GPOs based on where the user is, site, domain, OU, and so on. So what your typical like Citrix type of administrator will do is, if they do want any user settings at all, they'll apply to the GPO that the link to the OU where their servers are. The other thing with loopback processing is it's an all or nothing. If there's one GPO set to loop back in the session that's applying, they will all loop back. You don't do it on a per GPO basis. And that's the way I've only ever seen it used. There is a merge mode. And the way you want to think of merge is this. Computer goes, then user goes, which is normal. But then it replays the computer settings. It doesn't actually do it that way. It's smart enough to just figure it out. But that's how you want to think about it to try to help you figure out what happens in case of a problem. Computer, user, then computer goes again. So user settings do apply, but computer settings win because they apply last. GPO settings, and this goes back to a question somebody had earlier that I wasn't sure, and I said, hey, you know what? If you can expand on that with Sarah, we'll try to deal with it. And this is what I thought that participant was asking me. But so let me explain. GPO settings don't apply the same way to a desktop operating system as they do to a server operating system. You got your Windows 10, you got your Server 2016. They don't apply the same way. Let me read this side of the slide here first, okay, where it says asynchronous. This is how it applies to desktops. So, like it says, default processing of group policy on client computers. Client computers do not wait for the network before fully initializing. Existing users are logged in using cached credentials, and they actually apply the cached copy of their GPOs. Then the group policy is applied in the background. They do this because it results in shorter logon periods. So let me summarize that really quick by saying, if the user computer and user, if they've logged in before, they have a copy, it caches the GPOs locally, okay? So if you've logged on prior, if you've logged on before, it has a copy of your GPOs. It doesn't wait to get a brand new list of all the GPOs and reapply everything. When you log in, it does it kind of like cache credentials works. So in a way, it just logs you in with the previous GPO settings, last time you were still online. And then what it does is it refreshes them in the background. Something called client-side extensions process that in the background, meaning that after you've logged in, you got a working session, you got a desktop and you can work, the computer in the background is pulling the list of all your GPOs and checking, hey, is there any new GPOs? The GPOs that have already applied, is it still the same ones, the same version number? And if nothing's changed, it doesn't bother reapplying anything because it's already been applied. I mean, it'll reapply if the user managed to do something. What I'm saying is that GPOs have not changed. So there's no need to download them and reapply them again. And they do this strictly because it results in shorter logon periods. That's it. Servers, though, do it differently. Servers is the other column, the column on the left, which they say synchronous. So default processing on servers. Group policy for computers is processed prior to logon, which means when you see the logon screen on the server, all the GPOs have already applied. Okay, and then when you see the shell, or you see that your desktop says user group policy for users is processed before the shell is active. So by the time you see the shell, that means all the user settings have already applied, which means all the computer settings have already applied. Last bullet point says ensures reliable processing of group policy. So they do this because it's by the time you're working, by the time you got a shell at the user and you're logged in, you're working, everything's been refreshed, everything's been downloaded, everything's been applied, so you know there's no wiggle room here. But it does lead into much longer boot up times. It's one of the reasons, there's many others, but it's one of the reasons servers usually take longer to boot up. But because servers don't reboot very often, they feel comfortable in doing this. And because your users tend to log in way more often than their GPOs actually change, they feel comfortable doing that. That said, though, there is a couple of ways of changing this. I'm not going to get into that because that's not what this is about. But if you want to do the research, there are ways to change it so your desktop logs in synchronously, if you like. There's not many good reasons for it, but if you had them, you can. Okay. Identifying how GPO settings take effect. The following process is required to apply group policy settings. GPO replication. A GPO is actually made of two different parts. I'm not going to get into the technical names of it because it doesn't really matter. Well, it matters in the big scheme of things, but it doesn't matter for us right now. But there's two parts to a GPO. One is the actual file that's in your file system that's stored in the sysvol folder of your domain controller that contains all the settings. And the other one's the pointer in AD that says, hey, GPO3 should apply to OU number 5, the little link, if you want to call it that. And they both have two different replication processes. Right, sysvol gets replicated currently with something known as DFSR. With active, the link is, it's in your domain partition alongside user accounts and group accounts and passwords and everything else. Until the domain controller that's going to log on your user gets both of those replicated, it won't be able to apply the GPO. So it's a delay thing. If I make my changes right now and the user logs in 10 seconds later, whichever domain controller logged on my user might not have had both of those to apply it. So it looks like a problem, but it's not. It's just a matter of waiting or forcing replication. That's an AD thing, so we're not going to get into that. But your domain admins can force replication if it comes down to it. The next bullet point says replicate group changes. So let's go with the example where I filtered my GPO so only members of the marketing group will get it. Okay? So let's go with that scenario. Under that scenario, what if I add John to that marketing group? Will John get the GPO? Well, two things have to happen. The fact that I added John to the marketing group has to be replicated to all my domain controllers, or more interesting to us is the domain controller that's going to be logging on John. That's one. So where did that happen? Which domain controller was the change applied to? Did it replicate to all the other domain controllers? So it's just about making those changes to a local domain controller to the user as opposed to just any old domain controller. That's one. But the other thing is John has to actually log off and log back on so his security token can reflect the fact that he's not part of the marketing group. And they have to happen in order. The domain controller has to get the replication change, then John has to log off and log on, then John is going to appear to belong to the marketing group. So that's what they mean when they say replicate group changes. Lastly, refresh the group policy. Group policies apply, as we've said already, on the computer boot up for the computer settings, user logon for the user settings, but they also refresh on an interval. How often? On desktop operating systems, because we're talking about Windows 10 here, on desktop operating systems, it refreshes every 90 to 120 minutes. And again, there is a GPO setting that can change this. And not every GPO will refresh on an interval. Like think of a logging script. You have to actually log in to get a logging script. So I can, delete, create, edit, manage. I can do whatever, till the cows come home as far as logging scripts go. Refresh intervals ain't going to help me. My user has to actually log off and log back on. But there's only a handful of exceptions. The bulk of your GPO settings refresh every 90 to 120 minutes. So let's say you block the control panel via GPO. Let's say you went that way with it, right? Well, you don't have to log off and log on. When the refresh interval comes and goes, it'll block the control panel without the user doing anything. It just happens. So those are the three things that have to take place in order for the GPOs to apply. Options to initiate group policy setting preferences and policies really. They just be group policies in general. You can sign in and sign out, right? That'll initiate the user side of it. You can reboot the computer, which initiates the computer part of it. And of course, obviously, after you reboot the computer, you'd want to log on the user, so that would do that. But you can also do it manually. Now, I know what most of you are thinking about a particular command, but I do want to show you that there's also an option in the Group Policy Management console to push a group policy update. This became available back in Windows Server 2012. Right-click on OU, Group Policy Update. This will push the equivalent of a GP update, or push the update to the computers in that container. In other words, in this case, the manager's OU. Remember, we don't connect to users over the network, we connect to computers. So if you do that, it'll initiate an update to all the computers in the manager's OU, and then maybe, depending on the settings, on whoever's logged into those computers at that time. So you can do that as well. But remember this, most client-side extensions are the components that actually do this. Most client-side extensions do not reapply unchanged GPO settings. In other words, they'll look at a GPO and say, this is the list of GPOs that have to be applied. Okay, we got that. This is the version number of all those GPOs. Okay, we got that. On a refresh, it pulls a list of, not the GPO itself, but a list of all the GPOs that should be applying and their version numbers. And if they've not been changed, it doesn't bother. Why should it? I have those GPOs, I've applied those settings, leave them alone. So that's what it says, do not reapply unchanged GPO settings. And that brings us to this command here. There's a lot of, in my experience, a lot of misconceptions and a lot of confusion around it. The GP update command initiates a refresh interval. If you just type GP update and hit enter, and that's it, refresh, it initiates a refresh interval that holds 90 to 120 minutes thing. So the question then becomes, and I'm sure most of you have already used this command with a force switch. So the question is, well, what does the force switch do? Well, what the force switch does is it forces the computer, that's where the term comes from, to reapply all GPOs regardless if they've changed or not. When you just do an update, GP update, or let the refresh interval go by, or do the update via the console, it just looks for changes. If you run the command with a force switch, what you're telling the computer is, hey, go download all the GPOs regardless if they've changed or not, and reapply them all regardless if they've changed or not. Now, and this is just in my experience. Your experience might be different, but in my experience, most of the time, people that use the force switch, it really wasn't necessary. But you've heard or you've been told, your network team or your AD team say, hey, always do force. Okay, you always do force. You're not going to argue with them. But that's the difference between just GP update with GP update / force. Okay? Okay, what I'm going to do now is, all that was building up to what I'm going to show you next, actually. And these are the tools you can use to generate reports, try to help you figure out what's going on. So if you got a large infrastructure with hundreds of GPOs all over the place, hundreds of OUs, thousands of users, it obviously can get pretty complicated. So they're giving us two tools. Well, they're giving us a couple of tools. So in the Group Policy Management console, we have this thing here called Group Policy Modeling and Group Policy Results. I'm not going to demo Group Policy Modeling because the report it's going to give us is almost identical to what Group Policy Results does. But modeling is a what-if scenario for administrators to help plan their deployments, or well, GPOs at least. When I run Group Policy Results, I got to give it a computer's name, and it's actually going to connect to the computer and pull its event viewer logs of the last time the user has specified logged into it. So it actually pulls the event viewer log. So, the computer's got to be online, firewall has to allow remote management, you have to have rights to it and all that. But it's going to pull the event viewer logs and it's going to put all that into a report. The first part of the report, the summary, you're just hoping you see what it says there, which says no errors detected. If there's errors, well, you got to do your best to interpret them, whatever that is. You start Googling, I guess. But when this really starts to come alive is if you look at the details. So first thing in the details, it shows you general information about the computer, site that belongs to, domain, and so on. But it also gives you all the group membership. Why? Well, remember, because of filtering, I might or might not be getting a GPO because of a group I do or don't belong to. I know it's weird. It's a weird sentence to say, but group membership changes which GPOs you might or might not get. So they list them all for you. And those client-side extensions that we talked about, these are the client-side extensions that got applied. And they were successful. And this is how long it took to apply. And if you want, you could even pull the logs for them. Because you get that kind of thing a lot, right? Oh, ever since the GPO, my computer's slow. Well, it's possible. Well, we can take a look at that and see. And we can see that the GPO took the longest to apply with security settings. It only took a second and 109 milliseconds or whatever. Just no big deal. But you can use that to figure that out. And if you scroll down a bit under settings, you can actually open this all up and see which GPO settings are being applied from which GPOs. So there's a password history GPO policy setting, I should say, that's being applied. It's setting its value to 24 passwords remembered, and this is the GPO that applied them. Let me zoom in a bit so you can kind of see that a little bit better. Trying to arrange that a bit there. All right. So it doesn't tell you if there was conflicts. It doesn't tell you who won or who lost the conflicts. What it's telling you though is this is a GPO that applied those settings. So you can try to use that to figure out where these settings are coming from. And if you scroll further down, even just as importantly, applied and denied GPOs. These two GPOs were applied, this one and this one. But this GPO was denied. And if you look at that, it also tells you why. Reason denied, empty. And you can even look at that by the version numbers. It's never changed. There's absolutely nothing in it, so it didn't bother applying it. That's the computer part. And then you also have the same thing for user details. Now, I know a lot of you are probably saying, yeah, that's cool and all, John, but I don't have access to the group policy management console. So you can do this from a command prompt too. You can generate one of these reports in a command prompt. So what I'm going to do here, you can open a command prompt. And the command is called GP result. GP result, group policy result. And then you can run it with a bunch of different switches. Those are all your switches. But I'm going to use the /h switch, which generates an HTML report. /h, and then you got to give it a file location. And that's why I opened File Explorer. In my root of C, eventually, I get this report. And if I open this report with my favorite browser, whatever that might be, I get something that's extremely similar to what we saw earlier, except it's not tabbed. It's all just in one big, HTML page, but it's the exact same report. And I did this from the command prompt. I didn't need the group policy management console for it. And there's one more type of a report as well that I'm going to show you, and that's going to bring us to the end of our little presentation because we're running out of time here. But if I open up an MMC snap-in, well, if I open up a blank MMC, I can add a snap-in called result instead of policy. Again, zoom in to show you that. Resultant instead of policy. If I add this snap-in and I run the wizard, it's going to have two modes, logging and planning. Planning is like the group policy modeling. So logging is like the group policy result. I'm going to pick my computer, this current user, and I get a report that looks a little bit different, but it gives us a lot of the same type of info. The benefit of this one is that if you're new to GPOs, this kind of presents it to you as if you were actually editing the GPO. So it's easier to go back and find the settings once you know they're there. But there's the same setting as before. There's my enforced password history, set to 24, and instead of calling it a winning GPO, they call it a source GPO. Same thing. And lastly, if I come back to Group Policy Management Console, the GPO I created originally, I can right-click on it and say Advanced View, which also opens it up in Result instead of Policy. All right, guys? And we're going to leave it at that. So actually, that went probably 5 or 10 minutes longer than I wanted it to, but we had some good questions. So I hope it was worth it for everybody. So let me just throw it open now and just ask. You guys have any questions? Let Sarah know. She'll pass them on to me, and we'll do our best to answer them for the last 10 minutes that we have remaining to us.
Yeah, okay. So I have a few here. So when using roaming profiles, what group policy settings are needed in order to grant access for domain admins to the user profile folder contents?
Listen, I can't answer that off the top of my head. Like I said, there's like 4,000 or 5,000 different settings. If I had the next 20 minutes, we can pour through the GPO and find them, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. What I would say though is that you would look into the user configuration under policies and under administrative templates. That's where I would look for it, but I couldn't tell you, I couldn't pick the one policy out of the 4,000 or 5,000. So I apologize for that, but that's where you'd want to look for them. Thank you. Next question.
So if you have multiple groups in the security filtering area, does it have to be in both groups, or is it either or is it either group? So can you pick a group, or do you have to apply it for both?
Great question. It's like NTFS permissions. That's an or statement there. So I just had marketing in there. But if I added another group, that becomes an or. So marketing or IT or sales or HR. It's not an and. I think that's what you're asking. It's not an and statement. It's an or statement, just like NTFS permissions are. Next question, please.
Okay, so do you need Server 2016 to have Windows 10 related settings policies in GPMC without the need to apply ADMX templates?
Yes. Every server version has its equivalent desktop version, and it would have settings for that. So Server 2012 would have Windows 8 settings. Server 2008R2 would have Windows 7 settings. 2016 would have Windows 10 settings. Now, what you're saying is, I'm just going to expand on this since it came up in the question for everybody else that might not be aware. You can have an older version of Windows Server. You can have Windows Server 2008. Okay, and naturally that would have Windows Vista settings, but you can download from Microsoft website something called administrative templates, and the format, like the attendee mentioned, is an ADMX format. At least part of it is. So if you download those, there's a procedure to include them. So even though you have an older version of your server, you can have newer settings, but that's the only way to do it, to have Windows 10 settings if your server, if your domain controls are not 2016. Good question. What's next?
All right, I think this will probably be the last one because we're getting pretty low on time. What's the best way to do software development via GPO to computers that always connect via VPN?
Well, it depends on the type of VPN you're using. If you're just using traditional VPN, you can't. Traditional VPNs don't support GPO application because of your traditional VPN. It's user initiated, which means the computer account didn't log in. It logged on with cached credentials. The user account logs on with cached credentials. Then you initiate the VPN connection, so you don't have a proper authentication session. Any connect would fall into that category too. The only thing I know of, and of course it's a Microsoft solution, but the only thing I know of to apply GPOs in those type of remote environments is to use a Microsoft product known as, I'm drawing a blank now, Direct Access. There you go, Direct Access. It's something that's been around since 2008 R2, so server versions shouldn't be difficult for you to find that, to get that. But Direct Access is an evolution of VPN, just like any Connect is for Cisco, but it's Microsoft's implementation. But the nice thing about that is, if it's done right, it gets the computer account to log in as well as the user account, so GPOs will apply, even though somebody's sitting in a hotel room or sitting at home on their back deck or in a pool somewhere. If you want to take your laptop there, Direct Access would allow GPOs to apply. That's the only answer that I can give you. Is there other products out there? I don't know of any others. But the Direct Access is a Microsoft solution that would allow it.
What happens if you have multiple GPO with loopback settings, some set to merge and others set to replace?
Well, actually, with loopback processing, it's you're getting the computer settings to win, right? So the first GPO that it comes across says the opposite of last applied wins. The first GPO that you come across that has the loopback processing in a processing order, that would set the tempo. I would test that, to be honest. I can't say I know that for 100% for a fact, because I've never read that put that way, and I've never tested it that way. But from everything that I know about loopback processing and it works, that's what I would say would happen. But again, full disclosure, I can't guarantee it. I wouldn't bet a mortgage payment on it. I'll make a small wage on it, but not a big one, because I've never had to do it. But to the best of my knowledge, it would be the first GPO in the processing order that had the loopback setting. That's the one that would set the tempo. So I want to thank you guys all very much for being here. I really appreciate you guys being here. Hopefully I'll see you guys in one of these kind of classes in the future.